What do William Shakespeare, Ingrid Bergman and the painter Raphael all have in common? They all died on their birthday. Now, what does this piece of information tell us? Not a lot necessarily. Maybe they all had the same pessimistic sense of fatalism. Perhaps they enjoyed engaging in riskier activities on their birthday. Perhaps it tells us nothing at all. But what I've just shown you, by probing out of curiosity and asking this question, what links these three seemingly disparate people, is an example of associative thinking. And associative thinking is something that I've been fascinated with most of my life. I remember as a kid, I would spend my weekends at my grandparents' house. We would go round for a big Sunday lunch, and as we sat down to the table as dinner was being served, there would be this witty back and forth between my aunt, my uncle, my dad, my mother, my grandfather, and my grandmother. And as a young mind, this was fascinating, that these adults were able to converse so freely and so intelligently about different subjects, bringing in and weaving in different contexts and cultural references that I didn't really understand. But despite being endlessly entertaining and nearly making my grandfather choke on his food, I began to realise as I grew up that this type of thinking did not have much of a place in the real world. In the world we live in today, an empirical world defined by science and business and consumer capitalism, there is a need to be direct and efficient and economical. All of these things which are anathema to associative thinking. Associative thinking is this free-flowing sense of ideas and a web of thoughts and possibilities without ever arriving at a definitive point. Far more useful, it seemed, was convergent thinking or solution-based problem solving. And yet, in the last few years, tech CEOs, entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and all over the world, in fact, have started looking back towards this idea of associative thinking as a possibility, as a tool for mining creativity and intuition. Now, if, as I said, the world of business, science and tech is determined by science and empiricism, why do we need associative thinking? And why have they started to use it more and more in their work? Well, in the age that we live in, the market is full. And the only way to stand out from your opposition, from other people, is to be more expressive, to be more emotionally intelligent, to be more humanistic in your approach to life in whatever capacity that takes. Associative thinking gives you this because it gives you a sense of context. It gives you a sense of culture and an understanding of the world by probing, asking questions, looking for patterns and correlations between disparate ideas to find the commonality that we all have between us. And John Cleese, one of my favourite comedians, said that creativity is not a product in and of itself, but a way of operating in the world. And as somebody who operated extremely creatively, it's understandable that this is the way he thinks. As somebody who was able to collect and corroborate different personalities, to take a snapshot of the people he saw on the streets and on the television, and to synthesize them into characters that were endlessly relatable and entertaining for other people, is an example of associative thinking. He was looking for the imperfect human elements that we all have within us that could be turned into comedy gold. Creativity is something that is encouraged from a very young age, but is then not encouraged after a certain point. As we move out of school towards the world of work, it's not something that's going to get you a job, and so it's not something that's encouraged to be taught. And yet, these Silicon Valley CEOs, these new business owners, these new media types are looking to associative thinking as a way of breaking out of the nutshell of improbability and limiting realities that we live in today. Why does this come more naturally to some people than others? Why is it that some people can be free-flowing with their ideas and their thoughts, and others are more restrictive, more disciplined, more practical and pragmatic? I think there are some people who are more predisposed to this than others. And the psychoanalyst Jung said that men tend to push themselves more towards perfectionism. they look more for specialization and this idea of reaching the summit of their field. Women, by comparison, look for balance, wholeness, equanimity. Now, a lot of Jung's ideas have been declared as being outdated, and this is one that I think is open for interpretation, but something that I'm interested in. This idea of the male and female component parts within the opposite sex, what he called the anima and the animus. For Freud, within men, there is the anima, which means that this female component is what drives their intuition, their emotional intelligence, their ability to perceive patterns and correlations, and works in complementary abilities with their more pragmatic and what he calls male characteristics. Conversely, in the female, this is the idea of being more disciplined, pragmatic, and straightforward in your thinking, manifesting itself as the animus. Now, whether you want to take these names at face value is open for personal choice. But what I related to in this idea is this idea that men can often perceive in their overly analytical minds this tunnel vision attitude towards thinking. John Fowles, one of my favourite authors, said that the great difference between the sexes is that men see only objects, whereas women see the relationship between objects. He says, I will tell you what war is. War is a psychosis caused by an inability to see relationships, our relationship to our fellow man. So for those of you who are more analytical, not just men but women as well, how do we become more free-flowing and free-thinking? How do we become more expressive, and how do we look for patterns and connections to weave this intercontextual web of ideas to generate new thinking and to give us an advantage, whether that's on a social basis or on a professional level? I want to share with you 3 pieces of advice today, and this will help you to become more of an associative thinker, to move away from convergent thinking, which is restrictive and based on one solution. The first piece of advice I want to share with you is to become more curious, which is all well and good, but how do we put it into practice? Well, I want you to express your curiosity as often as possible by asking more questions. For example, if you see a chest of drawers in the corner of the room, how often do you stop and think, I wonder who made that? I wonder why they made it. I wonder when it was made and how it was made. You see, by asking these initial questions, you're opening up a whole contextual level of information, of additional knowledge, which is possibly irrelevant, but might possibly lead you to some more interesting answers. By asking these questions, you can say, is this thing typical of the time in which it was built? If it's not, why was this person thinking in this way that they built something differently to the rest of their colleagues and contemporaries? By practicing hypercuriosity, you start to see correlations between things that exist as isolated physical objects and other ideas and contexts which are all part of this larger web of human culture. The second point I want to share with you today is to start putting this into practice by writing down your ideas. George Carlin, the comedian, wrote down all of his ideas. He had a file of facts full of jokes, stories, one-liners, random quips and pieces of information that he could weave into his next routine when it was ready. He often didn't know when he was going to use them or how they would fit in, but that happens later down the line. You don't have to do the thinking, that will happen subconsciously. The first thing to do is just to make a note of them. And the third point I want to share with you is to take the first opportunity available to join an improvisation class. And I know what you're thinking, these improvisation classes seem like a terrifying prospect, not just to introverts but to extroverts as well, I can tell you that. Because in our mind we think that it's just going to be a bunch of artists, performers, possibly vain types as well. And I actually went to an improvisation class just before the lockdown and was surprised to see how many different people there were. There was a wildlife artist, there was a sociology professor, there was an analyst working with data, and then there was me, who was a tour guide. So people from 4 very different backgrounds who all arrived at the same place out of a curiosity to become more associative in their thinking, to become more free-flowing in their modes of expression. So there you go, 3 things that you can do to start becoming more associative in your thinking. to break out of your tunnel vision, your cul-de-sac rabbit tunnel approach of life, and to start tapping into your creativity and intuition.